Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny LeRae. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance member web meeting. As always, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us and for your partnership as Alliance members. I'm so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mike Stebbins. He's the president of Science Advisors and former assistant director for biotechnology at OSTP. He served in the Obama administration for nearly the entire 2 terms in that role. He's going to speak with us about a proposal which has been mentioned several times by President Biden called the Health Advanced Research Projects Agency, or HARPA. We want this meeting to be a frank discussion about both the potential opportunities and potential drawbacks associated with moving in this new direction. Our usual housekeeping, you can type your questions into the Q&A at any time, and my colleague Terry Schwartzbeck will pose as many as she can during our Q&A time. Okay, without further delay, over to you, Mike.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. And thank you for everyone for joining today. I know we've got a pretty good group. I'm willing to stay as long as as everyone would like to answer questions. I'm going to speak for a brief period of time about this idea of creating a DARPA-like agency for health, or HARPA, or as the administration's calling it, ARPA-H. I prefer HARPA because it's a great acronym, but with that being said, I'm going to launch into the general idea here, and I can speak to some of the history on it if you guys are interested in that later on. So, and there we go, okay. So first, there are approximately 10,000 human diseases, but we have interventions for only about 500 of them. And the reason for that is there's a massive market failure in the middle of the biomedical research enterprise. Current federal investment strategies do not adequately address the valley of death. In fact, the valley of death was created as an artifact of the way that we fund science today. HARPA would do for health what DARPA does for defense. That is to specifically create and deliver clinical solutions to difficult problems that fall into the valley of death or where there is a clear market failure. HARPA would bring a different set of tools, approaches, and focus to the development of new platform technologies and capabilities to transform medical innovation through time-bound, milestone-driven innovation. And it is a proven approach for driving innovation across many different agencies at this point. I want people to feel free to write to me directly at the end of the presentation if you have any interest at all in learning more about HARPA. But with that said, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. It's our contention that the federal government can directly address the massive market failure at the center of the health enterprise by establishing a new Health Advanced Research Projects Agency, HARPA or ARPA-H, whichever you want to call it. We're agnostic on that for the most part. Modeled after DARPA. The government has already created agencies with such capabilities for infectious disease with BARDA, energy and ARPA-E, Homeland Security and HSARPA, and in the intelligence community with IARPA. So we've got a track record here of success across many different areas, but we haven't taken that same approach and applied it to the over $3 trillion health industry that is supported in the United States. So a little history. DARPA was established in 1958. It's responsible for the internet, stealth technologies, radar, GPS, night vision, autonomous vehicles, and most recently the Moderna vaccine was created as a result of some of the initial investments that were made by DARPA over it's coming up on a decade now. So they're designed to make pivotal investments in breakthrough technologies for national security, directly address market failures that are impeding innovation for the defense industry. So a lot of people think, well, can't we do this at the NIH? So the NIH funds basic science and clinical research through grants. Grants are typically awarded to individual projects at academic institutions. Collectively, these projects form the bedrock of our knowledge about biology, health, medicine, and disease. The NIH investments are absolutely central to our knowledge base and our ability to create cures. But HARPA would take a different approach by providing a sustained drive needed to push through challenges and achieve medical breakthroughs by building new platform technologies. The US healthcare system largely relies on the private sector to make investments in to take basic research and develop commercially available treatments and cures. The model means that diseases for which investments are risky or downstream profit potential is low are often ignored, even though some of these are critical for public health, including antibiotic resistance, including Alzheimer's, many different rare cancers, you name it. There are thousands of diseases for which we've got plenty of people doing research on, but we don't have enough people doing development of treatments and cures and diagnostics for. So Harpo would step into where the private companies do not, addressing market failures where direct investments that ensure that within market failures with direct investments that ensure that all patients have a brighter future. So how would Harpo function? Different from the NIH, contracts that are large enough to provide a critical mass of funding, minimal bureaucracy, a portfolio approach to high risk, high reward efforts. This is not bread and butter research. This is high risk, high reward research that's where you're swinging for the fences. Government controls the contract. So if a project is not going well, the government pulls funding from that and places those dollars on another bet. So they draw top-notch talent. DARPA attracts world-class program managers, to say the very least. They wind up in places that you would be astonished to learn. And high turnover. The average DARPA program manager stays there for 3 to 5 years. So what's the not so secret sauce? So all funding allocations would be left to the discretion of the Harpa director. All funding oversight would be entrusted to Harpa program managers rather than risk-averse committees that run peer review, like the NIH. Funds would be awarded by milestone-driven contracts that give program managers the capacity for early termination if particular projects is not yielding desired results. This is critical, and it's rarely done at the NIH because of the way that they fund research. That research is critical, and because it's basic science research and forms this bedrock layer that we were talking about that everyone relies on. But we're not getting the treatments and cures that we need, and so we need a different approach to it. So again, the time is for Harpa is now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. Please feel free to write to me directly. We are circulating a support letter that I'm happy to share with you all at any point in time if you decide that you would like to support Harpa and add the names of your organizations to it. And I can also send you a copy of the white paper that we wrote through the Day One project. There was a documentary, a short documentary that was done on it that we can distribute to you all as well, whatever you like. We would like people to be comfortable with this idea of taking the next step in biomedical innovation through an advanced research project agency for health. With that, I'm happy to take any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and start with 2 questions. So how do we make sure that this effort doesn't take away from base funding at NIH?
Really good question.
Perhaps you could speak a little bit more about how you envision the relationship between Harpa and NIH.
Well, hopefully they would go hand in hand, and that in the wisdom of Congress that they wouldn't rob Peter to pay Paul. That would be a huge error, to say the very least. The NIH investments are critical for what we do in the United States in biomedical research and innovation. This is just a different approach. And so we would hopefully have a warm relationship, not just with the NIH, but with the FDA, the CDC, the VA, the DOD, so that we can take warm handoffs from there and develop them into products.
Mike, I'm going to ask another one, and then I see we already have a number of audience questions. So there are 2 federal programs that come to my mind that play a role more on the development side. One is NCATs, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science at NIH, and the other is BARDA. Yes. That has quite a high success rate in bringing products to market through public-private partnerships. Could you comment on what Harpo might take or not take, and how it might differ from either of those 2 programs?
Absolutely. NCATs was envisioned to actually have many of the qualities that we're talking about with Harpa, but a lot of the funding at NCATs is tied up. I think it's about 80% of the funding is tied up with the Clinical Translation Science Awards. This is dollars that go to universities where they do basic science and translational research with it, with very few strings attached. So it's not directed dollars towards individual projects. So very little of what NCATS does is actually directed towards projects that drive towards products. So in theory, we could have put something like this at an NCATS-like agency, but this is why the director of NCATS, Chris Austin, is supportive of Harpa, because it's complementary to what they do at NCATS. Similar to, and the same goes true with BARDA. BARDA's got has a narrow mandate, though, where they mostly work on select agents. And then in addition, antibiotic resistance was added during the Obama administration as a result of the executive order that President Obama issued on antibiotic resistance that created the CARB-X program. So, again, they're complementary. But there are lots of infectious diseases that BARDA can't touch, and there are lots of translational science questions that NCATS hasn't been able to touch, or frankly, where a Harpa could fund NCATS. NCATS has got a great program on drug repurposing, for example, that just is underfunded. And you could imagine a Harpa-like agency funding NCATS to run a drug repurposing program. They've got the robotics and the right expertise to do it.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to turn it to Terry. Terry, do we have some questions from our audience?
We sure do. And thank you everyone for sending in your questions. I'm just going to get to them as I can. Can you talk a little bit about the notion of milestone-based contracts is very interesting. How much flexibility would the director have to determine whether milestones have been met? If the research yields a different milestone that maybe was not considered in the original contract, maybe the funding could still continue. Any examples of this from other ARPAs?
Absolutely. It happens all the time where you get unexpected results, and sometimes those results are positive in a different way. And so they shift the nature of the goals. This is why the program managers work very, very closely with the organizations that they fund. They're on phone calls with them every week or 2 weeks, just to make sure that they're on target and they're working together. So it's absolutely critical to have those kinds of relationships. And that's something that most agencies can't do. They can't have program managers on phone calls with their grantees every single day. But in the case of a DARPA-like agency, they are on phone calls with them and in meetings with them all the time. I say phone calls now because there's far fewer in-person meetings these days. But the truth of the matter is that it's more of a partnership than it is just a relationship between a funder and a contractor.
Okay, great. Another question. How would Harpa incorporate the patient experience in its efforts to achieve breakthroughs?
That's a fantastic question, and it's a really difficult one. The patient experience is critical for determining where there's need. This is particularly important for people living with disabilities in the United States. And so one would hope that there would be some kind of feedback mechanism that would be built in, but we haven't envisioned a specific one, other than the fact that it should exist and that there should be some kind of strong relationship between the patient community and the goals of Harpa.
Great. And along the same lines, what areas of health research, if any, do you envision being the most needy or most appropriate for Harpa to dig into?
Oh, fantastic. I mentioned drug repurposing already. I think antibiotic resistance is another one where there would be a great opportunity to work with BARDA. But in addition, things like MRI machines, if you wanted to talk about a platform that could affect thousands of diseases at once, being able to improve the MRI machine by an order of magnitude and decrease the cost of an MRI machine would be top of my list.
Okay, great. A couple of questions about money. What kind of scale of budget level are you talking about here? And do you envision an average sort of check size that any individual project could receive, and how many years it could be funded?
Typically, DARPA dollars go out in the $1 to $5 million range, but the range is tremendous depending on the project, and you can imagine much bigger checks going out. and in terms of the scale of the operation, initially it would have to be just a couple $2 billion in order to get the organization going. There's been some talk of a $10 billion initiative over 5 years to start us off, but I think a percentage of the NIH budget would be the smartest way to do this. So say about 7% of the NIH budget would make sense for us.
And you mentioned the whole issue around standing up an agency. We have a couple of questions about that. What does it take to stand up an agency of this nature? Are the conditions similar to or different from those from DARPA? And also, what offices or programs would you envision existing within Harpa?
God, these are great questions. And we're getting into fantastic detail, which I love. So we would need to have. There's a couple different ways to do this. You could, in fact, put this within the NIH as an authority, but we think that might be an error because of the cultural differences that exist, and that it should be walled off as a separate agency. In order to do that, you would need legislation and organic language to create a DARPA-like agency within HHS.
Okay, Jenny, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm gonna butt in here. Let's talk about the role of the private sector, Mike. Where do you see venture philanthropy, venture capital fitting in? They've done a pretty decent job of spotting good opportunities to bring life-saving products to market. Where do you see, do you see that expertise coming in the form of project managers? How do you envision interacting with the private sector, both in the early stage world and larger companies?
There are two basic answers to that. The first one is, I think that people with expertise in the sciences and working in venture capital would often make great program managers. And so there's an opportunity there to bring program managers in who have that kind of expertise and have made those kinds of investments before. The second area is to work hand in hand with some of these to co-fund projects, because Harpa can de-risk projects for not just venture capital, but for philanthropies as well.
Okay, thanks. Terry, I'm going to go back to you.
Sure. Yes. So going back to budget just for a second, do you imagine that Harpa will need to be funded by a completely new appropriation?
Yes. They would need a new line in the appropriations bill.
Okay. Okay, great.
It could be done, as I said, it could be done in the NIH budget as well. But we envision this as a separate agency, which would require a new line in the appropriations bill, as well as organic language.
Have you thought of making this mandatory funding so as not to take funding from NIH?
Yes. As I said before, taking money from the NIH to do something like this would be a disaster. It would be a tremendous error in judgment to take money away from basic science research and clinical research that the NIH funds to fund something like this. What they do is critical. This is something different. And it's not something where one is better than the other. They work they're a complement to each other.
Okay, great. So many more questions coming in. Thank you to everyone who's sending them in. There's literally so many, like my screen is moving so fast. Let's see, going back up here. With a fair amount of discretion being placed in the hands of the Harpa director for deciding what to fund, how do we ensure that those decisions are evidence-based and fill the needed gaps?
Yeah, there's the same way you do with the DARPA director. You choose someone who's extraordinary, and they're term limited. So usually the DARPA director is replaced in every administration, and they serve for a relatively short period of time. And so there's that, and then there's checks and balances both at the level of the department and with Congress and with the president as well. So generally speaking, you have extraordinarily talented people in those roles, as evidenced by the success of the other agencies that I talked about earlier, ARPA-E, DARPA itself. So it basically means you are trusting an individual.
Another question.
And the program managers, for that matter, you're trusting the program managers tremendously.
So you mentioned BARDA earlier. If they were created to deal with the same valley of death you're talking about, why not just further broaden BARDA's mandate to cover what you want Harpo to do? Can we just maybe expand its purview?
In theory, you could, but BARDA is located under ASPR. And so this the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. So what you would be doing is really expanding the mandate of the entire section of HHS. And so BARDA was created with a very narrow and very specific purpose. And so I don't think that that purpose needs to be expanded necessarily. I think it serves itself it serves that need very, very well. So in theory, you could, but it seems like you would be doing that just for the purpose of not creating another agency. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It's sort of a square peg in a round hole.
Okay, great. Now there's some questions about the high risk model factor.
Yeah.
How would this work in a university environment, for example, where people can't be hired on a 6-month milestone basis?
Well, if you take it's true, they can't be hired on a 6-month milestone basis, but very few universities ever turn down DARPA money, that's for sure. And if you look at the money that comes out of the DARPA Biotechnology Office, the overwhelming majority of it goes to universities, not to companies.
Okay, and on a similar note, by definition, wouldn't a high-risk organization have a high failure rate? And
yes,
are there lessons that we've learned about how to deal with that politically and what kind of evaluation components we might use?
Yeah, it's fail often, fail fast is the idea here. And you have to accept that as part of what you're operating, your MO, so to speak. If you've got if you're swinging for the fences, you're going to get huge wins, but you're also going to get losses, and you just have to be able to ameliorate your losses through your successes, and really message clearly where you're having successes and where you're having failures. And the failures, that's why having these milestone-driven goals allows you to fail quick, so you're not losing tremendous amounts of money on something.
Jenny, did you have a question?
Oh,
I'm not sure I answered that very well, but I tried.
sorry, Terry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, go ahead. All right. So politically, let's talk about the political feasibility of this. We have some questions about how this has been mentioned by the Biden administration, I think even as recently as 2 days ago.
That's right.
Does this have legs, and who have been the strongest supporters in Congress so far?
We've got tremendous support in Congress. We've been working on this for about 4 years now, and we got very far in the Trump administration, in fact, on this, but ultimately failed to get them to move forward on it. So we have support from a good number of senators and congressmen and congresswomen on both sides of the aisle right now. I don't want to name names because they haven't come out publicly, other than DeGette has come out very strongly in favor of this. But I don't want to put words in their mouth. But needless to say, we've got very strong bipartisan support on the idea itself. And now we're working on the details of how we get this done. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to have the support of the White House, to say the very least, when you're talking about doing these sorts of things with Congress.
Yeah.
Congress was ready to move on this during the Trump administration, and they were waiting for signals from the White House to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got those very strong signals from the president, including having him meet with congressional leadership to talk about this one-on-one.
So Mike, you're a veteran of OSTP, and the person who will be heading OSTP has been elevated to a cabinet level position.
Yes, he has.
And as well has been.
As soon as he's confirmed.
As soon as he's confirmed, right.
That's right.
But Dr. Lander has been charged with creating, some biotech work within OSTP that does seem to have some development aspects to it. So some aspects that might be similar to what you're proposing or adjacent to what you're proposing. So could you talk a little bit about the role of OSTP?
I think OSTP is going to be critical in the formation of Harpa, particularly because of Eric's experience, obviously, in biotechnology and translational medicine at the Broad Institute. He also has a very, very strong history with PCAST and working with the President of the United States in his role there as co-chair during the Obama administration. So I think you can easily predict that Eric and OSTP will have a big role in the formation of Harpa and a big say in how it's set up. I think everyone can expect that for sure. Why not,
question
why not
that we
use one of
got.
the world's experts?
Thanks. A question that we actually got prior to this, online from someone who registered, I think is a good one in terms of the role of academic researchers. And this person talked about how the DARPA-like milestones mean that funding is committed for 6 months at a time, which is a much shorter time frame than is typically allowed for grants, at the university level. So how would you accommodate the academic, the needs of academics in working with this agency?
Well, as I said before, very few researchers and universities turn down DARPA dollars, so it would work very much the same way. And yes, you're giving them more money to basically buffer for that kind of for that work, but it is contract based rather than grant based, and it does take a little adjusting to.
And building on that, actually, another question just came in. Clinical trials often need years to generate measurable results. So what kind of milestones would Harpa seek to measure using this sort of shorter timeframe, especially if it came to the development of new therapeutics? Would conditions with longer endpoints be excluded?
No, you'd have to, they're absolutely right. You'd have to have longer endpoints for clinical trials because they do take longer. But we're also talking about the kind of work where we could establish platforms for accelerating clinical trials as well.
Okay. Another question.
Which takes a long time. Yeah.
Another question. Do you see Harpa supporting advanced research and development only, or also maybe post-marketing contracting, such as, for example, BARDA, Project Bioship contracts? Some of these therapeutic areas you mentioned for Harpa also take on valleys of death post-approval.
Indeed, one of the best examples of that is antibiotics, where there was a company that went out of business 2 years ago. Maybe it was last year. It's a little fuzzy with COVID. They had a brand new antibiotic on the market and were profitable, but they went out of business because of the market challenges. So absolutely, they would have to start dealing with some of the market challenges that happen post-approval.
Mike, you talk about market challenges post-approval. Let's talk about pre-approval. Obviously one of the major costs of bringing a therapeutic or vaccine or diagnostic to the market are the clinical trials and the process of FDA approval. What role do you envision Harpa playing in terms of bringing a product through the regulatory process?
That is a fantastic question, and I think we need a new model. And the new model, I mean, basically what we need to do is have Harpa work directly with the FDA right from the start on their projects and make sure that there is a clear pathway to approval, because it is a very difficult path to navigate. And so when making funding decisions, they should have in mind what it would take to get this product over the finish line with the FDA and get it into the marketplace. So we envision partnerships with the FDA as well as the NIH, the VA, the DoD, CDC at some point as well, and BARDA, just to start.
If you're able to arrange that, I think people will be knocking down your doors.
Agreed.
To get involved, if you're able to clear some of those, clear some of those pathways. It's
easier said than done, of course, and I'm making it sound trivial, but not deliberately. It's something that needs to happen in order to have these sort of advanced research projects accelerate.
And I'd say similarly with CMS, for example, too.
Oh, for sure.
Particularly on the device and diagnostic side. Actually, that brings me to another question. Do you also see Harpa working on devices and diagnostics?
Absolutely. There are technologies that are needed in the marketplace, and there's market failures around all of them.
So
sure. It could also work on things like drug costs and novel approaches to drug costs. There's lots of different things that, this is a wide open space here.
So on that note, what if, you can see, obviously, we all have a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions coming in, but what can interested institutions do to support this concept? And what are the biggest issues that need to be ironed out?
The biggest issue that needs to be ironed out is the legislation for forming it, and to make sure that Congress and the White House is aware that there's wide support in the across the advocacy groups for forming something like this. And so if people want to write to me directly, I can share with them the support letter, and they can make a decision of whether they want to sign on or not. We're going to keep the support letter open for another couple weeks, and then deliver it over to Congress and the White House. But our biggest challenge right now is going to be getting the organic language introduced for the formation of an advanced research projects agency for health. And we also believe that this will be in the president's budget. So initially this may exist under the NIH. That may be a way to go. So there's going to be lots of news in and around Harpa in the coming weeks, to say the very least.
We are coming close to our time. We have gotten lots of comments and questions that we haven't had a chance to go over. So we'll be sharing those with you, Mike. And perhaps you can respond to them, and then we can get those out to our audience. But I know you're really a warrior for this model and passionate about it, and that's wonderful. Your passion is palpable. What do you think are the biggest challenges ahead for this? What keeps you up at night? What do you think is going to be trickiest?
I think that's a great question, because the biggest challenge for me is the misunderstanding that there's a finite biomedical research pie, and that if we start to set up an agency like Harpa, that will take some of that pie, some of those dollars away from universities. And so I want to allay those fears that the majority of the dollars do wind up going to universities. They allow researchers to stretch their wings in ways that they've never been allowed to before. And it allows people to think differently about doing research. Rather than thinking incrementally, they can actually think about what would they do if they had their druthers. And so this idea that money would come from the NIH or would be taken away from the NIH to fund something like this is something that I don't think anyone supports. So I think that's been a big hurdle, is getting people to understand that nobody is arguing that dollars should be cut from the NIH in any way, shape, or form, or that this represents some kind of a vote against the NIH and the extraordinary legacy that they have. That's been a big challenge. Other than that, we've been in really good shape with the Biden administration.
Well, thank you, Mike. As I said, we'll be sharing the questions and comments we didn't get to, and I don't know if we were able to put Mike's slides in our chat. We'll certainly post those, and a recording of this will be available on our website. Thank you. This was really edifying.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. Please do write to me if you have any further questions, or if you'd like to talk.
Very good. Mike, are you offering to share your email?
Yeah, it was on the slides.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right. Thank you
.com.
so much. We really appreciate your time. Just to close out here, thank everyone for joining us today. And next week, we have an Alliance member meeting on Thursday at 2 p.m. with Dr. Sharon Zank, who is the director of the National Institute of Nursing. And there's a link in the chat where you can find the links to register for that meeting. So I think, we will also hear from Pete Kirkham from Red Maple Consulting. He'll be providing an update on the RISE Act and other relevant developments on Capitol Hill. So hope to see you next week, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.